Welcome, everyone. First of all, let me thank Bill Howell for opening our summit today and for agreeing to serve as president of IRFA this year. And again, I want to thank all of you and welcome you here. Thanks for braving the weather and for being here. This is why we put this on, is so you guys can learn and engage and interact and walk out of here more fired up than you came in. And today, that fire that you get in here might be useful as you leave. Thanks for Lucy for the introduction and for putting on this summit and for all the work she does all year round. And over there, Cassie, can you wave? There's Cassie Walter, our communications director, helping make sure all this goes. And then we mentioned that Nathan Hohenstein, our new policy director, is out at our booth. So we want to give a shout out to them as well. Now, there are a few of you here today who've been around long enough that if your memory hasn't faded too much, you might remember a very important day in biofuels history, March 6, 2000, because that was the day that I first went to work for Renewable Fuels. And so that was a pretty big day, at least for me. So basically, in a few short weeks, I'm going to be entering my 20th year of advocacy on behalf of farmers and biofuels and consumer choice. And that's kind of hard to believe, maybe even more so for some of you than it is for me. But as I enter that 20th year, I can still look around not the audience, many of these folks aren't here today, but I can still look around the industry and I can see the veterans of our industry. These were people who were here working on behalf of biofuels long before I entered that stage. And if you look up there, you can see Bob Deneen at RFA, John Doggett at National Corn Growers, Jeff Broyne at Poet, Ron Lamberty at ACE, even Troy Bradenkamp, who was with the American Farm Bureau back in the day working biofuels, is now with Renewable Fuels Nebraska. And so as I stand up here 20 years into the industry, thinking back on these veterans that were here before me, working for your industry, all I can think of is, man, you guys are really old. All right, so in the last 19 years, I've seen a lot. My first job was to duke it out with big oil over MTBE in California, and then in New York, some of you guys remember that. I missed the birth of the dry mill ethanol industry that happened in the 90s in Minnesota, but I did get to see it blossom across Iowa and the rest of the Midwest. Now, we also then had a multi-year debate, if some of you remember this, where we used to have this thing called the Reformulated Gasoline Oxygenate Standard, and that was our driving policy. We had this big debate in the industry over, should we stick to that, or should we put all of our hope in this new idea, this new thing called the Renewable Fuels Standard? I can remember when that was new. I helped put together, well, and then of course it took another 3 or 4 years to get Congress to pass that RFS. I've helped work on the creation of a federal biofuel or biodiesel tax credit. I helped work to extend the ethanol tax credit several times until it kind of slipped silently into the night in 2012. And then ultimately in 2007, we had the passage of RFS 2, which expanded the opportunities for ethanol and advanced biofuels like biodiesel. Now for the last decade, we've been a little bit more on the defensive. We've been defending all of the attacks against the RFS and making sure that that program works, but we've still been on the offensive as an industry. Think of the technology. You can see this out in the trade show. Better corn varieties, better yeast, better enzymes, more efficient production processes and control technologies. And we've got new products out of the ethanol plants like corn oil that wasn't even around when I started. That's a new product there, but it's also a new feedstock for biodiesel. All of this is happening. And even when we ran into roadblocks here at home to some market expansions, what did? We rolled up our sleeves and we worked to build new export markets. So as I stand here today with about 19 years of renewable fuels in the rearview mirror, I'm going to tell you my opinion was 2018 was the toughest year yet. Okay, now I'm not forgetting the commodity boom bust cycle in 2008. I'm not forgetting the devastating drought in 2012. And I'll admit that my view as a policy advocate might be a little bit different from a biofuels plant manager and what they have to deal with. But 2018 was a year of constant worry, work, uncertainty, frustrations that was only occasionally highlighted by good news. We had forces inside the EPA and inside the West Wing trying to convince President Trump to gut the RFS. And there were literally months last year when I went to sleep wondering if I would wake up the next day to a tweet that would announce, for all intents and purposes, the end of the RFS. And I was wondering if it would announce that basically the program was over that you and I had spent 19 years building. So I want to think back a little bit to 2018. 1 year ago today, we were here at this summit. and Texas Senator Ted Cruz was holding hostage the USDA nomination of Iowa's own Bill Northey. And that precipitated a series of, I think, 8 White House meetings on the RFS. Now, that may not sound like a lot to you, but 8's a lot of White House meetings. I mean, it's like more than they've done on Middle East peace, okay? And any one of those meetings could have ended with a tweet saying that the RFS was essentially finished. And through it all, though, and what I want to talk about today is the role that Iowa played. Because we were there, yes, IRFA, but it was way beyond that. It was our elected champions, our industry leaders, our farmers, and even our retailer friends. And one key event, so we had the summit there that started it, and one key event was when relatively new USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue went to the 2018 Commodity Classic. Now, he spoke and he said, I fully support the renewable fuel standard, and all that was good. But in other questions and things, he kind of gave the impression that RINs were just really something that refiners had to deal with. It wasn't really important to the farmer side of the RFS. He didn't really get that it was the accounting backbone of the program itself. Now, I want to be fair. The RFS is a complex problem, and he was new to this issue. But what happened next, I think, was one of the most pivotal events of all of 2018 because of the dividends it paid the rest of the year. And that is corn and soybean leaders out at the Commodity Classic leaped into action and proceeded to educate the Secretary on the importance of RFS and RINs to their bottom line. And yes, I think the Iowa corn grower leaders, many of whom are in the audience today, were at the forefront of that process. Now, it's safe to say, in my opinion, that Secretary Sonny, that's kind of how he likes to be called, left the Commodity Classic a changed man. He left there an absolute champion for farmers and biofuels producers and the RFS. And he was often, throughout 2018, the only RFS champion when they would get together meetings of the USDA, the EPA, and the West Wing staff. And so I just want to take a moment, if you guys would join me, to thank all of the Iowa corn growers and others who helped put Secretary Sonny on the right RFS path. Now, President Trump, he was still being pushed and pulled from all sides on the RFS. And so what did he want? He wanted a win-win deal. That's kind of his nature. He wants to find something for both sides. So Bill mentioned this earlier. He called together leaders from both biofuels and petroleum for a little White House sit-down. I think it was March 5th. I won't delve into this too much because Bill did, but if you think about who was in that room, we had Iowa Senators Chuck Grassley, Joni Ernst. We had IRFA board member Rick Schwark from Absolute Energy. We had IRFA member Randy Howard, then the CEO of the Renewable Energy Group. We had IRFA member Bill Horn, the chairman of Western Iowa Energy. And we had Iowa RFA's great friend, one of my favorite people in the world, Charlie Good, a C-store operator from near Nevada. Who else was in the room? Poet Biorefining and the Andersons. They're not headquartered here, but they've got plants here. So basically, the entire biofuels contingent was from Iowa. And so Iowa was very well represented in that meeting. But I think it's safe to say because of them, the biofuels industry was well represented in that meeting as well. So the outcome of that meeting, I think in hindsight, we didn't know this at the time, but it was also very telling. It was the first time that every single person who walked out of that meeting said, and even Ted Cruz tweeted this, that the president was ready to grant the ability for us to sell year-round E15 cells. So please join me in thanking Rick and Randy and Bill and all the other leaders for a job well done that day at the White House. Now, the president wants that win-win. So, he was talking about E15 over here. Well, what was that win for oil? That was less clear because news had started to leak out of these things called small refinery exemptions, SREs. And they had been granted, or at least rumored to be granted, by then EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. In fact, I started hearing rumors about that back in early January when I was out at some of the Growth Energy and RFA national conferences. But in the past, these had always been measured in like a few dozen million gallons, not hundreds. And they were almost always reallocated to the overall amount, so they weren't really lost gallons for us. And I remember thinking, wait a minute. There are very strict criteria for granting small refinery exemptions. I mean, we're hearing these rumors, but just how bad could it be under Scott Pruitt? Well, we learned about how bad it was going to be starting in January 25th. Jarrett Renshaw, reporter with Reuters, broke the news that 27 refiners had been seeking waivers. And I might be wrong, but I think within like hours, like RINs dropped like 60 cents. And over the next few weeks, more and more and more of this came out. We learned about the sweetheart deal for the PES bankruptcy, the refinery bankruptcy, where the EPA let them off the hook for their RINs when they didn't need to. And we started to learn that some of those really, really, really small refiners, like Chevron and ExxonMobil, were getting SREs. And it became pretty clear that Scott Pruitt was not being an honest broker. We now know that his one-man SRE wrecking crew destroyed 2.5 billion gallons of biofuels demand and quite frankly set the stage for some very trying financial times for our industry. Now, it is true that Mr. Pruitt was dogged by some numerous ethical questions, some ethanol questions too, but some ethical questions during his tenure there. But I think it was when it became clear that the American farmer could no longer trust him, that his days were numbered. So in June, he said, hey, I got to show President Trump that the farmers still love me. I got to get out there. So he went on a trip to Kansas and South Dakota and Nebraska. Now, it's not surprising to us, but let's just say that Secretary Pruitt did not exactly get the reception that he was hoping for. Now, he was pretty smart in one thing. He didn't come to Iowa. He might not have gone back to D.C. But while he avoided Iowa, he did go and he got an earful from farmers who were quite, quote, mad as hell. And I also want to add one other story. And I'm actually not sure if I'm supposed to tell this story, so turn off all the recorders back there. But right after he went to those 3 states and really heard it from farmers, you saw some of those pictures on the slide before. I've always wanted to do one of those tractorcades and barricade something, but my board won't let me. But then there was a meeting with the Missouri corn growers and USDA Secretary Perdue. Well, Pruitt, this thing hadn't gone well, right? This little roadshow hadn't gone well. So he said, hey, Sonny, can I come hang out with you at the Missouri corn growers? Maybe I'll get a better reception there. And you know what Missouri corn growers did? They called back the secretary and said, if you're bringing him, there's no meeting. Wow. They simply did not want to be a prop for a guy who would come out in the Midwest and say all kinds of nice things about farmers and then go back to D.C. and stab an SRE knife in their back. And I think those 3 meetings and that one non-meeting in June, quite frankly, had as much to do, if not more to do, with his ultimate resignation than his ethanol problems. So please join me today in thanking those farmers who put aside their Midwestern nice to speak the truth to power. It truly did make a difference. And I have to admit, I know this is petty, and I know it should be beneath me, but I really can't help but derive a little bit of pleasure every time now I get to say former EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. Now, throughout this time, the other side, they never stopped trying to get President Trump to do a so-called deal on the RFS. But our champions never wavered. I mean, all of these meetings at the White House, all these other things that went on at different times, I mean, time and time and time again. Sure, we wanted year-round E15, but not at the cost of gutting the RFS. So I hope everyone in this room understands just how much we owe to Governor Reynolds and to Senators Grassley and Ernst. Every single time we needed them to stand fast, they stood fast. And with their incredible leadership, we beat, think about this, all these attacks that we had, we beat every known attempt to gut the RFS. There was the point of obligation effort, something called NOTA, some of you remember. We had API wanted to cap the RFS at 9.7%. Cruz wanted the 10-cent RIN cap. There was Pruitt's export scheme, and on and on and on and on. With their help, we beat back every one of those. Yet, unbeknownst to us, our champions, Pruitt was granting these dead of the night, and I think the courts may ultimately find illegal, small refiner exemptions. And once those were known in the marketplace, it took a terrible toll. RIN prices dropped to levels that only Ted Cruz could love. Ethanol margins sagged to multi-year lows, and blending began to go down as well. And I have to admit it, when all this was kind of coming out, I was a little depressed. I was watching a policy that you and I had fought for more than a decade to defend being gutted by an action we didn't even know about at the time, so we couldn't fight it. And I've often said that taking on the world's most profitable and powerful industry is not for the faint of heart. And during this time, I kind of questioned my heart a little bit. But you know what? Everywhere I turned, this industry just kept fighting. We had record biodiesel production, record ethanol exports, and folks just said, keep telling the truth, keep putting the facts out there on small refinery exemptions and on E15. And I do feel truly lucky to be able to work for an industry like this. We get knocked down sometimes, but you guys, you just get back up and you go right back to work, and that's what we did here, and that's when the tide began to turn. So on July 26th, President Trump chose where? Iowa, Northeast Iowa this time, to come in and commit and highlight his commitment to jobs and farmers and E15, and he had his little I think it was Make Our Farmers Great Again hat, and when he came into Northeast Iowa, he said, hey, we are very close to doing 12-month E15. And it was also then, those words that was exciting to hear, very close. I mean, you can't say very close very many times, right? I mean, it's something's got to give. And so it was kind of a boost to us, but it was also a galvanized, a last-ditch effort by petroleum to squeeze even more gallons out of the RFS than the small refiner exemptions were. And in the middle of this period, we heard that Secretary Perdue was going to come to the Farm Progress Show last year. Well, look, there was no way that we were going to let the Secretary of Agriculture come to the largest outdoor gathering of farmers and not hear about the RFS and E15. So the IRFA staff dropped everything. And for 3 days, we worked like crazy to organize a Make the RFS Great Again rally out there. I want to give a special shout out, I'm not sure if they're in the room, but to Sukup Manufacturing. They let us hold the rally inside their giant grain bin out on the facilities out there. I want to give a shout out to Iowa Corn. We held a sign painting party, and you can see some of the signs. There were lots more out there. And then all the national biofuels groups helped as well. They organized speakers, and we had all this. And in those 3 days, over 200 farmers showed up. And at the last second, Secretary Perdue even kind of went off of his schedule at the Farm Progress Show, came into our event, and said, hey, I just talked to the president this morning about E15, and he said, let's get it done. And then he kind of hinted that a big announcement might be only a few days away. Well, it wasn't, but it did take a few weeks. But then in October, not October, I think it was, it was October 9th, President Trump once again chose Iowa to make a big announcement. He went to Council Bluffs, and he said, today we're unleashing the power of E15 to fuel our country all year long, not just those 8 months. And so that was the magic words that we'd been waiting to hear for a very long time, and that started a process. Now, the White House did announce at the same time that E15 would be coupled with some RIN reform measures, but those measures would not affect RFS volumes. No point of obligation, no RIN cap, no export scheme, just year-round E15. In the midst of a very tough year, we really do need to take a moment to savor that victory. Now, as we savor that victory, we do not forget the incredible damage that small refinery exemptions have caused. We don't forget the pain that that's caused our industry, but we also have to remember, even after all of the small refinery exemptions were going, oil wasn't just happy. They kept to the last second trying to do even more demand destruction to the RFS in linking it to E15. At the end of the day, petroleum lost and we won. Now, I began by noting that 2018 was my toughest year yet, and it was, in biofuels, but the year ended on a high note with the unfettered victory, clear victory for year-round E15. So now as we shift into 2019, I think it's clear as we look forward, the state of Iowa's renewable fuels industry is hurting, but it's hopeful. Iowa producers have had some record, we see some slides up here. The ethanol plants in Iowa produced 4.35 billion gallons of ethanol in 2018, and of course corresponding amounts of distillers grains and corn oil. Biodiesel producers really ramped up production in Iowa and produced a record 365 billion gallons of biodiesel. But we did have the SREs and the China trade dispute, so our ethanol producers are facing a prolonged period of basically break-even or even negative margins, the likes of which we haven't seen for really since some pretty bad times in the past. And biodiesel producers are forced to sell their product based on the hope that Congress will eventually retroactively reinstate the biodiesel tax credit to make them whole. It's not a real fun way to run a business. But we were hopeful as well. We do have ample feedstocks, we've got efficient production capacity in this state, and we have the ability to once again power the rural economy if we can be unleashed. Now, my wife is fond of telling me, Monte, hope is not a strategy. And so I want the record to reflect today, maybe somebody can film this and get it to her, my wife is right. I want to say that. But our hope, the hope I'm talking about here, is not just a passive hope. It's a hope that rests on a willingness to roll up our sleeves and get to work to confront the many outstanding issues that we have going into 2019. And our summit speakers and our trade panel, or our roundtables, they're going to get into that all throughout the day. So I'm just going to do a brief overview here. You know, we've got, what do we got here? We've referenced those SREs that former EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt granted. Well, we've got dozens and dozens more that are sitting there from the 2018 year waiting for the new acting administrator, Wheeler, to decide on. Mr. Wheeler has said, hey, I'm doing transparency. I've got a dashboard. You know how many there are. It's not all in the dead of night anymore. And we do commend that. That is helpful. But it reminds me a little bit of I'm an old guy, remember? So it reminds me a little bit of these old Westerns where there's a damsel in distress and she's kind of tied to the railroad tracks and here comes the train. Now, is the guy on the white horse going to get there in time to rescue her? And I noticed, it's kind of a cliche in old movies, and I noticed that sometimes that damsel had on a blindfold and sometimes she didn't. And it got me thinking, if the train hits, is the pain any less because you weren't wearing a blindfold, because you saw it coming? So look, my point here is transparency is nice and we appreciate it. But what's really important is what will the final decisions be on granting the small refinery exemptions. That is what will really matter. Now, he said they're reviewing that process, Mr. Wheeler has, and they're reviewing the criteria. But the fact of the matter is, until Wheeler takes actions on the 2018 SRE request, we simply do not know if a more judicious approach will be taken going forward post-Pruitt, or whether we're still going to hand these things out like Halloween candy, whether we're wearing a blindfold or not. Now, there's also a lot of EPA rules out there that are come down the pike this year. We've got the E15 RVP rule, the year-round E15 rule we discussed. Will they get it done by June 1st? We've got the rule coming out that will set RFS levels for 2020. A very important rule is going to be coming out this year, the Rfs Reset Rule, where the EPA now has the authority to rewrite the congressional schedule from 2020 to 2022. And that's important too because the same criteria they use there is what they're going to use from 2023 on. And so we're getting some hints there. And we're going to have a policy roundtable that explores that later today. Now, I don't know if there's a couple of you in here, but the lawyers are really happy in 2019 because we've got biofuels lawsuits all over the place. I think there's at least 4, there might be more. There's at least 4 small refinery exemption lawsuits challenging everything from the criteria on how they were granted to what's an extension to why aren't they being reallocated. And those are going to have a huge impact on us. There's lawsuits that the oil industry has filed on the annual RFS levels. And I'm really watching one, I call it the remand lawsuit, where the D.C. Circuit Court a couple years ago told the EPA, you illegally lowered 500 million gallons of ethanol from 2016, give it back. And the EPA has not given it back yet. We need to see how they resolve that this year. And I think there's a near certainty that we'll have lawsuits over E15 year-round sales once that rule is finalized. And we're going to have there's a lawyer here today who's in the middle of many of these, Adam Gustafson, and he's going to be talking this afternoon, so you might want to check into that. There's also always the opportunity for new legislation in Congress. There was a lot of talk last year, although to be honest with you, I don't think the chances of anti-RFS legislation passing in 2019 are very good. On the other hand, we do need Congress to reinstate and extend for multiple years the biodiesel tax credit. And we've got trade issues. We've got this current thing going on with China. If we can open that up, that'd be huge for ethanol demand in 2019. And so, in fact, last year we sent Iowa Corn joined us and sent a trade mission to China, and we're going to hear about that mission and other trade issues right after lunch. So how that goes is pretty big. And also in trade, one of the reasons biodiesel had such a good year in 2018 is we finally held Argentina accountable for illegally dumping biodiesel in this country with some action by the Department of Commerce, but now word's coming out of D.C. that Commerce might reverse that decision and snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. So we're going to be working on that issue. Having that level playing field was key to that. So quite frankly, when you look at the plethora of issues that are facing us in 2019, I'm not going to be surprised if 2019 goes down in biofuels history as one of the most impactful years, for better or worse, since 2005. Now, we may not like every answer we get. this year, but I think it can be a good year and a great year. And I think that, and the reason for that is I just simply refuse to bet against IRFA, against our members, our elected champions, and more importantly, all of you, from the farmers and the investors in the audience today to the suppliers and the fuel retailers. Despite the ups and downs of the policy, biofuels remain low cost, clean burning, low carbon, and high performing fuels. And when given a chance, consumers again and again show with their pocketbooks that they will support biofuels. So on behalf of the IRFA staff, let me assure you that we are ready to work alongside of you on these issues. And with your help, we can make the RFS great again. Thank you for being here.